People think I'm a monster because of the $94,000. They focus on the math, the wire transfers to JP Morgan Chase, the drained 401k. But they re-looking at the wrong ledger. The money was just the score. What I really did to Robert Miller that took a different kind of craft. You have to understand Robert. He has 69 lives in a quiet house in Columbus, Ohio. He is the kind of guy who still irons his button-downs, even if he is just going to the grocery store. He was a history teacher. He spent his life explaining the past, but after his wife died, he didn't have a future. That's where I came in. I wasn't some faceless hacker in a basement. To him, I was Sarah Jennings. I was a trauma nurse, a hero in scrubs, someone who saw the worst of the world and needed a safe place to land. I used an AI voice cloner to give Sarah this specific catch in her throat when she talked about her long shifts. It sounded like exhaustion. It sounded like she needed him. But the real hook, the thing that guaranteed he'd empty his accounts without a second thought, was the scarf. I'd seen a photo of his late wife from the 90s, wearing this very specific navy pashmina. I spent hours tweaking a generative video prompt until Sarah was standing in a snowy park, that exact scarf wrapped around her neck. Looking right into the camera and telling him she loved him, I watched him watch it. I could practically hear his heart break and mend at the same time through the screen. He thought it was a miracle. He thought he was protecting a saint. He had no idea I was just a ghost in the machine, waiting for the right moment to let the beeping of a fake hospital monitor do the rest of the work. He walked into that Lexington hospital in his best ironed shirt, clutching flowers for a woman who never drew a single breath. I didn't just rob him. I killed his last reason to wake up in the morning. You have to understand what Columbus looks like in late November. It is a city of long gray shadows and a sky that stays the color of a wet sidewalk for weeks at a time. The wind comes off the Scioto River and just bites right through you, turning the world into this desaturated, icy blue landscape. Robert Miller lived right in the heart of it, in a beautiful, drafty old brick house in Clintonville. It was the kind of place that smelled like lemon wax and old library books, filled with heavy oak furniture that was built to last 3 lifetimes. Robert was a man who respected things that lasted. He spent over 30 years at the front of a high school classroom, his lanky frame pacing the aisles while he talked about the fragility of empires and the weight of the past. He had this habit of pushing his gold-rimmed spectacles up the bridge of his nose with his index finger whenever he was about to make a point. It was a teacher-esque tic, the sign of a man who was used to being the smartest person in the room, the one everyone looked to for answers. But after Martha died, the only thing that heard his voice was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. He was 69 years old, and he was drowning in a very specific kind of American silence. It is the silence of a man who did everything the right way. He worked the job, he paid the mortgage, he loved his wife until her very last breath. And his reward was a house that felt less like a home and more like a museum dedicated to a life that had already ended. I watched him through the digital trail he left behind, a path of breadcrumbs that told me everything I needed to know before I even sent the first message. I saw the way he'd spend hours on history forums, correcting people's footnotes on the Battle of Gettysburg just to feel a spark of his old authority. I saw the grocery orders for 1 single steaks, small cartons of milk, frozen peas. He was a man of immense discipline. Every single morning he'd iron a fresh button-down shirt. He'd starch the collar until it was stiff. He'd polish his shoes until he could see his own tired reflection in the leather. He was dressing up for a life that had already left the building. He had this routine that was as steady as a heartbeat. He'd walk down to the library on High Street, his silver hair neatly combed, looking like the quintessential retired academic. He'd nod to the neighbors, maybe comment on the frost on the pumpkins, but he never stayed long. He didn't want to be a burden. He didn't want anyone to see the hollowness behind his eyes. He was a protector by nature, a provider who suddenly had no one left to provide for. That is a dangerous state for a man to be in. It is a vacuum, and nature hates a vacuum. I sat in my room, miles away from the gray chill of Ohio, and I mapped out the contours of his isolation. I knew exactly how much he missed the sound of a woman's voice in the kitchen. I knew how much he ached for the feeling of being the person someone called when the world was falling apart. The tragedy of Robert Miller wasn't that he was weak or senile. It was that he was decent. He believed in the inherent honor of people because he had spent his life surrounded by books that told him honor was the only thing that mattered. He was a relic. He belonged to a world where a man's word was his bond, and a lady in distress was something you dropped everything to help. I looked at the photos of his house, the pristine lawn, the well-oiled porch swing, the American flag hanging by the door, and I didn't see a home. I saw a vault. I saw $94,000 sitting in a J.P. Morgan Chase account, doing nothing but gathering dust while Robert waited for a reason to matter again. He was a man waiting for a miracle, and I was more than happy to manufacture one for him. I just needed to wait for the first real snow of the year to hit Columbus. I needed him to feel that extra bit of cold before I gave him the warmth of Sarah's voice. He was sitting in his study, surrounded by the ghosts of dead presidents and his own memories, completely unaware that the most dangerous thing in his life wasn't the winter or his age, it was the notification light blinking on his tablet. I started with a message that looked like a mistake. That is the oldest trick in the book because it immediately puts the victim in the position of the helper. It gives them the high ground. I sent him a photo of an old stone bridge down in Lexington and asked if this was the spot where that Revolutionary War skirmish he mentioned in his blog had happened. I knew it wasn't the right bridge. I knew he would know it wasn't. Robert was a history teacher. He couldn't help himself. He had to correct me. He did it gently, with that polite Midwestern patience that makes men like him so easy to bleed dry. I apologized, told him I was just a traveling nurse trying to learn about the area I had just moved to, and said I felt like a total idiot. That is the hook. You do not come on strong. You come on small. You make them feel like the smart one, the capable one. You make them feel like you are lucky to have bumped into them. I built Sarah Jennings to be his perfect match. I did not make her a 20-year-old swimsuit model. That is for the amateurs who want a quick $1,000 from a lonely guy in a basement. I wanted the whole vault. I made Sarah 44. I gave her soft features, blonde hair pulled back in a practical clip, and a tired smile that said she had seen too much in the trauma units. I used a generator to put her in wrinkled blue scrubs, standing in a hospital hallway with those flickering fluorescent lights that looked slightly too green. Just like a real hospital. I even added a little bit of stray hair falling out of her ponytail in one photo. It is the imperfections that sell the lie. If a photo is too perfect, the brain flags it. If it is messy, if there is a coffee stain on the badge reel, the heart accepts it as truth. By the second week, I was not just Sarah the nurse. I was Sarah the soulmate. I started using the voice software. I would take a real recording of a nurse from a medical documentary, feed it into the program, and then I would type out exactly what Robert needed to hear. When I called him, my voice did not sound like a computer. It sounded like a woman who had been on her feet for 12 hours and just needed to hear a friendly, masculine voice before she collapsed into bed. I would let my voice crack just a little bit when I told him how hard it was losing a patient that day. I would wait for the silence on his end, that heavy, sympathetic silence, and I knew I had him. He was not just listening to a woman. He was rescuing her. He was the only person in the world who understood her. I made sure to tell him that every single night. The real masterstroke, though, was the scarf. I had spent hours digging through his late wife's Facebook page, the one he still posted on every year for her birthday. I found a photo from 1998. She was wearing this specific, desaturated blue silk scarf with a tiny floral pattern. It was her favorite. He had mentioned it in a comment 3 years ago, saying how he could still smell her perfume on it if he closed his eyes. I took a screenshot of that scarf, fed it into the image generator, and prompted it to put that exact pattern on Sarah. I sent him a short video clip. No sound, just Sarah walking through a park in the biting Kentucky cold, wrapping that scarf tight around her neck and blowing a kiss to the camera. When he saw that, the game was over. He did not see a scam. He did not see a digital fabrication. He saw a sign from God. He saw his wife giving him permission to love again, to protect someone new. He called me sobbing, his voice shaking so hard he could barely get the words out, telling me he had never seen anything so beautiful. I sat there in my chair, watching the signal bars on my screen, and I did not feel a damn thing except the itch to get into his JP Morgan Chase account. I told him I felt a connection I could not explain. I told him he was my rock. And once a man like Robert Miller thinks he is your rock, he will let you grind him into powder just to keep you standing. I had him right where I wanted him, wrapped in a memory he didn't know I'd stolen. Most people think a scam is about the money. It is not. The money is just the scoreboard. The real game is the oxygen. You have to become the very air the mark breathes. If they stop talking to you, they should feel like they are suffocating. That is how I handled Robert Miller. Every morning at 5:45, before the sun even hit the rooftops in Columbus, I sent him a text. Just finished my rounds, it would say. Watching the sunrise and thinking of you. You are the light at the end of my tunnel. I knew his routine better than he did. I knew he would be sitting in that kitchen his late wife picked out, drinking black coffee and staring at the empty chair across from him. My message was the first thing he saw. I became his purpose before he even put on his glasses. I used a voice cloning program I bought for $60 a month. I fed it hours of audio from actual nursing seminars and healthcare vlogs until I had Sarah Jennings down to a science. She sounded exhausted but resilient. She had this soft, Midwestern lilt that reminded him of home, but with a slight rasp that suggested she had been up all night saving lives in a Lexington trauma unit. When I called him, I always had a soundscape running in the background. I had a library of files. The distant rhythmic chirp of a pulse oximeter. The muffled announcement of a code blue over a PA system. The squeak of rubber soles on polished linoleum. I would whisper into the phone, telling him I only had a minute between patients. I told him the hospital was short-staffed and the trauma was starting to get to me. He would tell me to stay strong. He would tell me that the world needed people like me. He would call me his hero. And I would sit there in my darkened room, watching the audio waves bounce on my monitor, thinking about how easy it is to bleed a good man dry when you give him a reason to feel important again. The first time I asked for money, it was not for me. It was for a patient. I told him about a young girl in the pediatric wing whose parents could not afford the specialized transport to a facility in Cincinnati. I cried. The AI voice handled the sobbing perfectly, that hitch in the throat that makes a man's chest tighten. I told him I was putting in my own money, but I was short $3,000. Robert did not even hesitate. He went straight to the JP Morgan Chase branch on High Street. He told me later that the teller looked at him funny when he asked for the wire transfer, but he did not care. He felt like he was part of a mission. He felt like he and Sarah were a team, two souls against a cold, indifferent world. That was the hook. Once he paid once, he was invested. It is a psychological quirk called the sunk cost fallacy, but I just call it the tether. Every dollar he sent made Sarah more real. If she was a scam, then he was a fool, and a man like Robert Miller, a respected history teacher, could not be a fool. So he doubled down. He started seeing signs everywhere. I sent him AI-generated photos of Sarah in the hospital break room, holding a coffee cup with his name written on it in Sharpie. I used a generative tool to place her in front of a window where you could see the Lexington skyline. I even sent him a photo of a stethoscope draped over a copy of a history book he had mentioned loving. I told him I was reading it to feel closer to him. He started dismissing the red flags like they were annoying gnats. His sister, who lived in Dayton, started asking questions. She asked why Sarah could never face time. I had an answer ready for that. Sarah's phone had been dropped in a sterile wash, the camera was cracked, and she was too busy working double shifts to get it fixed. Besides, the hospital had strict privacy protocols about cameras in the wards. Robert defended me. He told his sister she was being cynical, that she did not understand the pressure of the medical field. He chose a digital ghost over his own blood. That is the moment I knew I had him. When the mark starts isolating themselves to protect the lie, you own them. By month 4, the requests got heavier. I created a fake legal dispute with Sarah's ex-husband over a property in Kentucky. I sent him PDFs of court documents I had mocked up using professional templates. They looked official. They had seals and signatures and legal jargon that would make anyone's head spin. I told him my bank accounts were frozen during the litigation, and I could not pay my nursing certification fees. If I did not pay, I would lose my job. I would lose my housing. I would be forced to move back to Oregon to live with my abusive parents. Robert was frantic. He was not just sending money anymore, he was saving a life. He started pulling from his 401k. He told me he was happy to do it. He said the money was just paper, but our future was real. I would spend hours on the phone with him, letting him describe the house we were going to buy together in the Ohio countryside. He wanted a wraparound porch. He wanted a garden where Sarah could relax after her shifts. I agreed with everything. I told him I could see the fireflies in the yard already. I told him I had never felt so safe. I sent him a video then. It was the one with the blue scarf. I used a deepfake suite to map Sarah's face onto a stock video of a woman walking through a park. I color-corrected the scarf to match the exact shade of his late wife's favorite one. When he saw it, he called me in tears. He said it was a miracle. He said he felt like his wife was giving him a blessing from the other side. I remember eating a sandwich while he sobbed, checking the balance on the Bitcoin wallet where I was laundering his retirement. I felt a flicker of something then, but it was not guilt. It was a sort of professional pride. I had reached into this man's soul and rewired his memories to suit my balance sheet. The bank tried to stop him one last time. A manager at Chase pulled him into an office because the frequency of the wires was hitting every red flag in their system. Robert told me about it that night. He was angry. He said they treated him like he was senile. He told the manager to mind his own business, that he was a grown man making his own choices. He moved his remaining funds to a different institution just to avoid the questions. He was protecting me. He was protecting the dream of the woman in the blue scarf. He was 69 years old, and he was ready to go broke for a person who did not exist, all because I knew how to play the notes of his loneliness like a piano. He was not just a victim. He was my most dedicated employee, working every day to ensure I never had to work a real job in my life. And the best part was he thanked me for the privilege. He thanked me for letting him love me. I told him I was scheduled for a minor surgery, a complication from an old injury. I told him I was scared. I told him I wanted him there when I woke up. I gave him the name of a hospital in Lexington and a room number. I knew he would go. I knew he would buy flowers. I knew he would drive those 3 hours with a heart full of hope. I just needed one last big transfer for the surgical deposit. He sent it at noon. By 2 o'clock I had closed the accounts and deleted the Sarah Jennings profile. I sat in the silence of my apartment, the AI voices finally quiet, and I wondered if he would still think the scarf was a sign from God when he was standing in a hospital hallway, holding a bouquet of lilies, looking for a woman who was nothing more than a collection of pixels and a well-trained algorithm. I doubted it. But then again, men like Robert Miller have a way of holding onto a lie until it chokes them. It is easier than admitting the air they were breathing was never there at all. People always ask me when the stealing actually starts. They want to know the precise second a conversation turns into a crime. But that is the thing they do not get. It is all a crime. From the very first hello, I am already reaching into their pockets. I am just doing it slowly so they do not feel the draft. With Robert, I waited 3 weeks. 3 weeks of talking about his late wife, Martha. 3 weeks of listening to him drone on about the Civil War curriculum he used to teach at Columbus North High. I knew the names of his neighbors on that quiet, tree-lined street in Columbus. I knew he liked his coffee black and his mornings silent. I knew the exact shade of blue Martha used to wear when they went out to dinner at that little steakhouse on High Street. I was not just a voice on the phone. I was the only person who actually listened to him, and in his world, that made me more real than the people he saw at the grocery store every day. He was 69 years old. At that age, if you are not careful, you start to feel like you are disappearing. You become a ghost in your own house, surrounded by furniture that has outlived its purpose. Then Sarah Jennings comes along. She is 44, she is a traveling nurse, and she thinks he is the most fascinating man she has ever met. I made sure her voice sounded tired every night. I used a sophisticated AI voice cloning suite to add just a hint of a tremor, a slight rasp in the throat, like she had been on her feet for 12 hours in a high-stress trauma unit in Lexington. It makes a man like Robert feel protective. It triggers that old provider instinct that had been rotting away in his chest since the day they buried his wife. He did not just want to talk to me, he wanted to shield me. The first ask was a masterpiece of insignificance. It was a Tuesday night in November. The kind of night where the Ohio sky turns a flat, oppressive gray that makes everything look like a charcoal drawing. Robert was sitting in his den, probably with a glass of cheap scotch and a history book, waiting for my call. I did not call him at the usual time. I waited. I let him sit in the silence for 2 hours. I wanted him to feel the weight of his isolation. I wanted him to worry that his new light had gone out. When I finally dialed, I did not use the normal Sarah voice. I used the one I had tweaked for genuine distress. I added the sound of wind in the background, a low bitrate recording of a hospital parking lot at night. I made sure to sniffle once or twice before I spoke. When he answered, his voice was so thick with relief, it was almost pathetic. Sarah, is that you? Honey, are you okay? I let out a shaky, programmed breath. I told him my car would not start. I was in the parking lot in Lexington, it was freezing, and the alternator was shot. I told him I had the money in my savings, but my bank had flagged my card for suspicious activity because I had tried to pay for a new medical certification earlier that morning. I was stuck. I sounded small. I sounded like a woman who just needed a hand. Now Robert is a smart man. He spent 40 years teaching kids how to spot propaganda and historical fallacies. But loneliness is a hell of a drug. It bypasses the logic centers of the brain and goes straight for the ego. He did not ask why I could not call a friend in Lexington. He did not ask why I did not call a tow truck myself. He just asked how much I needed to get home. I told him the tow and the part would be $480. I told him I felt terrible even mentioning it. I told him I would pay him back the second my bank cleared the hold. I was laying it on thick, talking about how embarrassing it was to be a grown woman who could not handle her own business. That is the secret. You do not demand the money. You make them insist on giving it to you. You make it their idea to be the hero. I watched the notification pop up on my burner phone. Zelle $480. It was nothing. I spend more than that on a decent dinner. But that was not the point. The point was the commitment. The point was the yes. Once a man like Robert Miller says yes to a small thing, his brain starts to rewire itself to justify the decision. He is not a victim of a scammer yet. In his head, he is the white knight who saved the beautiful, exhausted nurse from a cold night in a dark parking lot. He felt 10 feet tall that night. He probably slept better than he had in years. And me, I just looked at the balance and smiled. I did not need the money for a car. I was sitting in a climate-controlled apartment 2,000 miles away, watching the numbers climb. I sent him a photo 20 minutes later. It was an AI-generated image of a blurry car dashboard with the battery light glowing red. I had the software set the metadata to Lexington, just in case he was savvy enough to check the file properties. He was not. He just texted back, "Get home safe, Sarah. You are a godsend." A godsend. That is what he called me. I was the person who was going to take his retirement, his dignity, and his very will to live, and he was calling me a blessing from heaven. It is almost funny if you do not think about it too hard. But I do not think about it at all. I just think about the next step. Because once you get the first 500, the next 5,000 is easy. You just have to keep the music playing. You have to keep him believing that he is the hero of the story. The visual palette of his life was changing. It was not just gray anymore. It was that desaturated winter blue. Cold, crisp, and lonely. I was the only warmth he had left in the world. And I was going to make sure that warmth cost him every single cent he had ever saved. He thought he was buying a future. I knew he was just buying a front row seat to his own destruction. And the best part was he was going to thank me for it. He was going to thank me all the way to the bank. I was not just taking his money. I was taking his reality. And honestly, he seemed happy to let it go. It is easier to live in a beautiful lie than a cold, empty house in Columbus. I just provided the service he was begging for. I gave him a reason to wake up, and all it cost him was a little bit of digital currency. We were both getting what we wanted. At least that is what I told myself while I waited for the next deposit to clear. You have to understand the psychology of a man who has lost everything that matters. Robert wasn't just lonely. He was untethered. When his wife Martha died, the gravity holding him to the earth just sort of let go. He was floating in that big, empty house in Columbus, surrounded by ironed shirts and history books that nobody wanted to read. I didn't just give him a girlfriend. I gave him a job. I gave him the role of the protector, and that is a drug more addictive than anything you can buy on a street corner. Once I had him hooked on the idea that Sarah needed him, the escalation wasn't even a challenge. It was a natural progression. It was a symphony I was conducting from a laptop 3 states away. The first real pivot happened about 3 months in. Up until then, it was small stuff. A broken laptop, a car repair, a few $100 here and there to show he was a gentleman. But I needed to see how far he'd go. I needed to see if he was ready for the big numbers. So I sent him the video. I spent 3 hours tweaking the parameters on the generator to get it just right. I found an old Facebook memorial page for his wife and saw a photo of her at a garden party in the 90s. She was wearing this specific silk scarf, a deep teal with these delicate gold threads running through it. It was her favorite. He mentioned it once in a late-night text, how she used to smell like lavender and expensive fabric. I generated a video of Sarah. She was standing outside a hospital in Lexington, the wind whipping her blonde hair across her face. She looked exhausted, her eyes a little puffy, like she'd been crying after a double shift in the trauma unit. And around her neck, tucked into the collar of a heavy winter coat, was that exact same teal scarf. I didn't say a word about it in the message. I just said, I am thinking of you, Robert. You're the only thing keeping me going through these night shifts. He lost his mind. He called me 10 minutes later, his voice shaking so hard he could barely get the words out. He thought it was a sign from God. He thought Martha was giving Sarah her blessing from beyond the grave. He was crying, actually sobbing into the phone, telling me how much he loved me. And I just sat there, muted the mic for a second to take a sip of coffee, and then came back with that soft, AI-enhanced voice. I told him I felt a connection to that scarf, that I'd found it in a vintage shop and felt like it was meant for me. That was the moment I knew I owned him. When you can co-opt a dead woman's memory to sell a lie, you don't just have their bank account. You have their soul. That S when the medical bills started. I didn't just ask for money. I created a crisis. I told him Sarah had been involved in a multi-car pileup on I-75 while driving home from the hospital. I didn't just tell him, though. I let him hear it. I used a voice cloning suite to create a series of audio files. I called him from a spoofed number that looked like it was coming from a hospital. I didn't speak. I just let the audio play. It was a masterpiece of sound design. The rhythmic high-pitched chirp of a heart monitor. The distant muffled sound of a PA system calling for a code blue. And then Sarah's voice. It was weak, raspy, barely a whisper. She was calling his name. Robert, Robert, are you there? I am so scared. He was at the J.P. Morgan Chase branch in Columbus before they even opened the doors the next morning. He was frantic. He told the teller his fiancée was in a coma and he needed to wire $12,000 for an emergency surgery that the insurance wouldn't cover because of some bureaucratic loophole I'd invented. The teller tried to warn him. They always do. They have those little pamphlets about elder abuse and scams. But Robert wasn't hearing it. To him, that teller was just an obstacle between him and saving the woman he loved. He told them to mind their own business. He told them he was a retired teacher and he knew exactly what he was doing. He walked out of that bank feeling like a hero. He just sent me the equivalent of a year's worth of his pension, and he felt 10 feet tall. I watched the deposit hit. It was like a hit of adrenaline. But I couldn't let the tension drop. In this game, if you give them time to breathe, they start to think. And thinking is the enemy of the long con. So 2 days later, there were complications. I sent him PDFs of medical invoices that looked more real than the ones you get from an actual doctor. I used generative AI to create letterheads for the University of Kentucky Medical Center, complete with fake physician signatures and itemized lists of surgical supplies. I charged him for everything: anesthesia, post-op imaging, specialist consultations. Every time he hesitated, I'd sent him another audio clip of Sarah's mother crying, thanking him for being the angel their family needed. I had him in a state of constant, low-grade panic. That desaturated winter blue I mentioned. That was the color of his life now. He stopped going to his weekly bridge game. He stopped answering calls from his daughter in Cincinnati. He told her he was busy with a private matter. He was isolating himself, which was exactly what I needed. The more alone he was, the more Sarah became his entire universe. He started selling off his things. He had a collection of rare history books, first editions he'd spent 40 years hunting down. He sold them to a dealer for a fraction of what they were worth just to cover a hospital administrative fee I'd cooked up. He was down 60,000 by month 6. You'd think a man would wake up at that point. You'd think he'd see the math doesn't add up. But that's where the sunk cost fallacy kicks in. If Robert admitted this was a scam, he had to admit he'd been played by a ghost. He had to admit he'd thrown away his wife's legacy on a series of pixels and synthetic sounds. His brain wouldn't let him do it. It's a survival mechanism. He had to believe Sarah was real because the alternative was too dark to face. He was staring into the abyss, and I was the only thing holding his hand. By the end of the 7th month, he was tapping into his home equity. He was 69 years old, and he was taking out loans against the house he'd lived in for 30 years. He was sending me 5,000, 10,000 at a time. I was buying crypto, laundering it through 3 different mixers, and watching my balance climb towards 6 figures. I wasn't even Sarah anymore. I was a force of nature. I was the consequence of his grief. The last big hit was for the experimental treatment. I told him Sarah's lungs were failing from the accident, and there was a clinic in Switzerland that could save her, but we needed 25,000 for the medical transport. I sent him a photo of a private jet with a medical cross on the tail. It was a fake generated in seconds, but to him it was a chariot. He didn't even blink. He went back to Chase, argued with the manager for an hour, and threatened to move all his accounts if they didn't process the wire immediately. He was protecting her. He was the man Martha always knew he was. He was a savior. And as I clicked confirm on that final transfer, bringing the total to $94,000, I almost felt a flicker of something. Not guilt, just a sort of professional appreciation. He'd given me everything. He was empty. And the best part was he was still thanking me. He was still sending texts to a dead number, telling Sarah to hang on, telling her that he was coming to Lexington to bring her home. He had no idea that Sarah didn't exist, and that the man he thought he was had died the moment he met me. He was just a ghost in a cold house, waiting for a woman who was never going to wake up. I knew the moment he started the engine in Columbus. I could feel it in the silence of my inbox. You get a sense for when the fantasy starts to rub up against the real world, and the friction is always what kills the high. Robert didn't just want to help Sarah, he wanted to see the look in her eyes when he saved her. That's the thing about men like him. They don't just want to be good. They want to be witnessed being good. He drove 3 hours south on I-71, probably humming some old tune, feeling like a teenager on his way to prom. He had a bouquet of white lilies on the passenger seat. ID told him once that Sarah loved them because they reminded her of rebirth. I actually just picked them because they read common in funeral arrangements. A little private joke for me. He pulled into the parking garage at the University of Kentucky Medical Center, adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses in the rearview mirror, and smoothed down that silver hair. He looked like a man about to claim his prize. I was already gone, of course. The burner was at the bottom of a dumpster behind a gas station, and the money was bouncing through a dozen different crypto wallets. I didn't have to watch him walk into that lobby, but I've seen it enough times to know exactly how it went down. He would have walked up to the reception desk, clutching those flowers like a shield, and asked for Sarah Jennings. He probably used his teacher voice, calm, authoritative, the voice of a man who expects answers. The receptionist probably frowned, typed the name into the computer, and shook her head. No Sarah Jennings in the system. Not in ICU, not in recovery, not on the surgical floor. Robert would have been patient at first. He'd explain about the accident, the Switzerland flight, the trauma unit. He'd show her the photos on his phone, those beautiful, AI-crafted images of Sarah in her scrubs, smiling through the exhaustion. That's when the pity starts. That's the worst part for a man like Robert. It's not the anger, it's the way the nurse's face softens when she realizes she's looking at a ghost. She would have called a supervisor. Then security. Not because he was a threat, but because he looked like a man who was about to have a stroke. He's standing there in his ironed button-down, surrounded by the smell of antiseptic and the sound of rolling gurneys, holding $90 worth of dying flowers, and he's realizing that the last 8 months of his life were a movie playing in an empty theater. Security probably took him to a small side room. They do that to keep the grief out of the hallways. They told him there was no Sarah Jennings. There never had been. No nurse by that name, no patient by that name. They asked if he had a family member they could call. Robert just sat there. He didn't cry. Men like Robert don't cry in public. They just hollow out. He looked at the photos on his phone, the scarf that looked like Martha S., the hospital monitor beeps that ID looped from a YouTube video, and he realized he'd been talking to a mirror. I don't feel bad about it. Why should I? I gave him the best 8 months he'd had in a decade. He felt knighted. He felt strong. He felt like he had a reason to wake up and check his bank balance. The $94,000. That was just the tuition for the hardest history lesson he ever had to learn. People think the scam is about the money, but it's not. It's about the collapse. It's about that moment in the Lexington hospital where the lights are too bright and the air is too thin, and you realize that the person you loved was just a collection of pixels and a voice synthesized in a basement. He drove back to Columbus in the dark. He didn't even take the flowers out of the car. He just left them on the passenger seat to wilt in the cold. When he got back to that house on the quiet street, the silence was different. It wasn't the silence of a widower anymore. It was the silence of a fool. He looked at Martha's picture on the mantle, and he couldn't even look her in the eye. I didn't just take his savings. I took his dignity. I took the one thing that kept him tethered to the world, the idea that he was a protector. Now he's just a lanky old man in a big house, waiting for a phone that will never ring again, listening to the echo of a woman who never existed. He's not a hero anymore. He's just a man who paid $94,000 to realize he's completely alone. You're sitting there right now, scrolling through your feed, thinking you'd see through it. You think the red flags would be screaming at you like a siren in a quiet neighborhood. But that's the thing about a well-built lie, it doesn't sound like a lie. It sounds like hope. Robert didn't lose his money because he was senile or stupid. He was a history teacher. The man spent his life analyzing facts and looking for patterns. He lost it because I understood the geography of his grief better than he did. I knew that a 69-year-old man in Columbus who just lost his wife doesn't he want a fat bank account, he wants a purpose. He wants to be the guy who sweeps in and saves the day. I gave him that. I let him be the hero of a story that ended in a total wreck. If you want to know how to spot someone like me, look at the speed. Everything with Sarah was a crisis. Trauma units, sudden surgeries, licensing fees that had to be paid in an hour or she'd lose her career. I kept him in a state of constant cortisol. When your brain is flooded with stress, you don't ask why a traveling nurse needs a wire transfer from JP Morgan Chase to some third-party account. You just hit send because you can bear the thought of her suffering. And the technology. It's better than you think. That voice he heard on the phone wasn't a recording. It was a live AI clone. I could make her whisper his name. I could make her catch her breath between sobs. I even layered in the synthetic beeps of a hospital monitor in the background. It's a sensory assault. You're not just talking to a person, you're living in a movie I am directing. The real hook, the thing that sealed his fate, was that blue scarf. I found an old photo of his wife Martha from a decade ago on a memorial page. She was wearing this specific, intricate floral pattern. I ran that through a generator and put it on Sarah in a video I sent him. When he saw that, he didn't see a stranger. He saw destiny. He thought Martha was sending him a message from the beyond, telling him it was okay to love again. That's the level of cruelty you're dealing with. I didn't just use his heart, I used his memories as a weapon. Now Robert sits in that house on the quiet street and the walls are closing in. He doesn't iron his shirts anymore. He doesn't polish his spectacles. He just stares at the empty space where $94,000 used to be and the even bigger empty space where Sarah used to be. He realized that every I love you was just a line of code. Every thank you for saving me was a script I wrote while I was sitting in my pajamas eating takeout. He not just broke, he spiritually bankrupt. He can trust a voice on the phone. He can trust a face in a photo. He can even trust his own instincts. So here's the lesson Robert learned the hard way. If someone you've never met in the flesh asks you for a dime, they are a predator. If they have a crisis every time you suggest a video call, they are a ghost. And if they seem too perfect, like they were designed specifically to fill the holes in your soul, it's because they were. I designed Sarah to be Robert's perfect ending. Instead, I was his ruin. Don't think your intelligence will save you. Only your cynicism can do that. Because out here in the dark parts of the web, we aren't looking for your money. We're looking for your need to be loved. And once we find that, the money just follows like a dog on a leash. He's alone in the dark now, and honestly, I am already looking for the next hero.